The sun hung low over Copper Ridge, casting long shadows across the dusty main street as the afternoon heat shimmered off the wooden storefronts. It was the kind of day that made decent folk seek shelter indoors, but trouble had a way of finding its way out into the open, especially in a town like this one. Sarah Mackenzie adjusted her medical bag and stepped carefully around a loose plank on the boardwalk, her white nurse's apron already showing the dust and grime of another long day tending to the sick and wounded in this godforsaken corner of the frontier. She had come to Copper Ridge 3 months ago, answering a desperate telegram from the town's doctor who had fallen ill with consumption. What she found was a community barely hanging on, plagued by violence from a gang of outlaws who had made the surrounding hills their stronghold. The Crimson Creek Gang, led by a vicious man named Jake Morrison, had been terrorizing the area for nearly a year, robbing supply wagons, rustling cattle, and worse. The local sheriff had been bought off or scared off, depending on who you asked, and the decent people of Copper Ridge lived in constant fear. Sarah had seen enough suffering in her 26 years to know that running away wasn't always an option. Someone had to stay and help these people, and if that someone had to be her, then so be it. She had trained as a nurse back in St. Louis, working in the charity wards where she learned to patch up knife wounds and bullet holes just as expertly as she could deliver babies and treat fever. The frontier demanded a different kind of healer, one who could work with steady hands even when gunshots echoed in the distance. As she made her way toward the small clinic she had established in the back room of Henderson's General Store, Sarah noticed an unusual quiet had settled over the town. The few people she passed on the street avoided her eyes and hurried along with their heads down. Something was wrong. She could feel it in the way the air seemed to hold its breath, in the way even the dogs had stopped barking. The answer came soon enough. As she rounded the corner near the blacksmith shop, she heard the sound of horses approaching at a gallop, accompanied by rough laughter and shouting. Her blood ran cold as she recognized the voices. The Crimson Creek Gang was riding into town in broad daylight, bold as brass and twice as dangerous. She pressed herself against the wall of the blacksmith shop and peered around the edge, hoping they would pass by without noticing her. But hope was a luxury she couldn't afford in Copper Ridge. Jake Morrison himself was leading the group, his black hat pulled low over eyes that held no warmth, no mercy. Behind him rode 6 of his men, all armed and looking for trouble. They reined up in the middle of the town square, their horses pawing the ground and snorting, as if they too sensed the violence that was about to unfold. Morrison's voice boomed across the empty street as he called for the townspeople to come out and show proper respect to their betters. Slowly, reluctantly, doors began to open, and people emerged from their hiding places. Sarah watched in horror as families clustered together, parents pulling their children close, everyone too terrified to run, but knowing that staying might be even more dangerous. The outlaw leader began one of his typical speeches about how the good people of Copper Ridge needed to show their appreciation for the protection his gang provided. Protection from what? Sarah had never been able to figure out, since they were the only real threat for miles around. But she had learned that men like Morrison didn't need logic to justify their cruelty. They only needed power and the willingness to use it. That's when Morrison's eyes found her. Even pressed against the wall, she couldn't escape his notice. A cold smile spread across his weathered face as he pointed directly at her. Well, 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 if it isn't our pretty little nurse. Come on out here, darling. Don't be shy. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest, but she forced herself to step into the open. She had learned long ago that showing fear only made men like Morrison more dangerous. She kept her chin up and her voice steady as she spoke. I'm just trying to get to the clinic, Mr. Morrison. Mrs. Henderson's baby has been running a fever all day. Morrison dismounted from his horse with the casual grace of a man who had spent most of his life in the saddle. He was tall and lean, with the kind of face that might have been handsome once, before years of violence and whiskey had carved deep lines around his eyes and mouth. "Now that's real touching, sweetheart. Always thinking of others, aren't you? But I'm thinking maybe it's time somebody thought about you for a change." The other men in his gang chuckled and made crude comments that made Sarah's skin crawl, but she held her ground. She had dealt with men like this before, and she knew that running would only make things worse. "I appreciate your concern," she said, keeping her voice as level as she could manage, "but I really do need to check on the baby." Morrison took a step closer, close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath and see the cruel gleam in his pale blue eyes. "The baby can wait. I've been thinking about you a lot lately, Miss Mackenzie. A pretty woman like you, all alone in this rough town. It ain't natural. A woman needs a man to take care of her." "I take care of myself just fine, thank you." Sarah clutched her medical bag tighter and took a small step backward, but Morrison matched her movement, closing the distance between them again. "Do you now? Well, I think it's time you learned what it means to have a real man looking after you." His hand shot out and grabbed her wrist, his fingers closing around it like a vice. Sarah tried to pull away, but his grip was too strong. The medical bag fell from her other hand, spilling bandages and bottles of medicine across the dusty ground. The townspeople watched in helpless horror as Morrison began dragging Sarah toward his horse. Some of the women were crying, and she could see the shame and rage in the men's faces, but she also knew that none of them would risk their families' lives by interfering. She couldn't blame them for that. She had seen what happened to people who crossed Jake Morrison, but as Morrison hauled her across the square, his grip on her wrist sending shoots of pain up her arm, she heard something that made her heart leap with desperate hope. The sound of a single horse approaching at an easy pace, the rider in no hurry but absolutely certain of his destination. Every head in the square turned toward the sound, and Sarah saw Morrison's expression change from cruel amusement to wariness. The rider who appeared at the end of the main street was not what most people would have expected of a hero. He was of average height and build, wearing a plain brown duster coat and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. His horse was a sturdy-looking bay mare, nothing fancy, but well cared for. What caught everyone's attention, though, was the way he sat his saddle, with the easy confidence of a man who had spent years facing down trouble and coming out on top. He rode slowly into the square, his pale grey eyes taking in the scene with the calm assessment of someone who had seen it all before. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the silence, pitched low, but carrying an unmistakable note of authority. "Afternoon, folks. Seems like there's some kind of disagreement going on here." Morrison's grip on Sarah's wrist tightened painfully, but he tried to project his usual bluster. "No disagreement at all, stranger. Just having a friendly conversation with the lady here." "Nothing that concerns you." The newcomer dismounted and tied his reins to a hitching post with the unhurried movements of a man who had all day to get where he was going. When he turned to face the group, Sarah could see his face clearly for the first time. He was probably in his early 30s, with the kind of weathered features that spoke of long days in the sun and wind. There were laugh lines around his eyes, but his mouth was set in a hard line that suggested he had seen enough of the world's cruelty to last several lifetimes. "Doesn't look too friendly from where I'm standing," he said, his gaze fixed on Morrison's hand, wrapped around Sarah's wrist. "In fact, it looks like the lady would rather be somewhere else entirely." Morrison's face flushed red with anger. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by some drifter who had the audacity to ride into his territory and question his actions. "Listen here, mister. I don't know who you think you are, but this is my town. What I do here is my business, and I suggest you climb back on that horse and ride out while you still can." The stranger's expression didn't change, but Sarah noticed his right hand had shifted slightly, hovering just above the grip of the Colt revolver holstered at his hip. It was a subtle movement, but one that Morrison and his men couldn't have missed. The tension in the square ratcheted up another notch as everyone waited to see what would happen next. "Name's Thomas Wade," the stranger said, his voice still calm and conversational, "and I make it my business to help folks who can't help themselves. Now, I'm going to ask you politely to let go of the lady and ride out of town. You do that, and we can all go about our day peacefully." Morrison laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it that hadn't been there before. "Thomas Wade? Never heard of you. You must not be much of a gunfighter if nobody knows your name." Wade smiled for the first time since he had arrived, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. "Well, Jake Morrison, I've heard plenty about you, enough to know that you've been making life miserable for these good people for far too long. Time for that to change." The fact that Wade knew his name seemed to shake Morrison more than he wanted to admit. He glanced around at his men, looking for support, but they were all watching Wade with the wary attention of predators who had suddenly realized they might be facing a bigger predator. The smart ones were already calculating their chances of making it out of town alive if this turned into a shooting match. Sarah could feel the change in the atmosphere, the way the very air seemed to crackle with impending violence. She had been in enough dangerous situations to recognize the signs. Men were about to die in this dusty square, and she might very well be one of them if she didn't act quickly. She tried to pull free from Morrison's grip again, but he hauled her closer, using her as a human shield. "You want her so bad?" Morrison snarled, drawing his pistol with his free hand and pressing the barrel against Sarah's temple. "Come and take her, but I guarantee you'll be watching her die first." Wade's demeanor changed in an instant. The casual, almost lazy confidence was replaced by something much more dangerous. His grey eyes went cold as winter ice, and when he spoke, his voice carried the promise of death. "That was a mistake, Morrison. A big one." The outlaw leader realized his error almost immediately, but it was already too late. By using Sarah as a hostage, he had crossed a line that Thomas Wade would never tolerate. The gunslinger had spent years hunting down men who hurt innocent people, and he had developed a particular hatred for those who threatened women and children. "Last chance," Wade said, his hand now resting openly on his gun. "Let her go, and you and your men can ride out. Keep holding her, and I promise you won't live to see another sunrise." Morrison's nerve finally cracked. With a curse, he shoved Sarah away from him hard enough to send her stumbling to the ground, then swung his pistol toward Wade. It was exactly the opening the gunslinger had been waiting for. His Colt seemed to leap into his hand with impossible speed, the draw so fast that most of the witnesses would swear later that they never actually saw his hand move. The sharp crack of gunfire echoed off the buildings surrounding the square, and Morrison's pistol went flying from his grasp as Wade's bullet shattered his wrist. The outlaw leader screamed and fell to his knees, clutching his ruined hand to his chest. Before his men could react, Wade had shifted his aim to cover the rest of the gang. "Any of you boys feeling lucky today?" he asked conversationally, as if he hadn't just demonstrated the kind of shooting skill that most men only dreamed of possessing. The answer was apparently no. One by one, Morrison's men raised their hands and carefully moved away from their weapons. They were hardened criminals, but they weren't stupid. They had just seen their leader, a man they had thought was invincible, brought down in less time than it took to blink. None of them were eager to test their draw against Thomas Wade's. Sarah pulled herself to her feet, her legs shaking from the adrenaline and fear that were only now beginning to hit her. She looked at Wade, this mysterious stranger who had appeared out of nowhere to save her, and felt a confusing mixture of gratitude and curiosity. Who was he? What had brought him to Copper Ridge at exactly the right moment? Wade moved through the group of outlaws with practiced efficiency, relieving them of their weapons and tying their hands behind their backs with lengths of rope he produced from his saddlebags. Morrison continued to moan and curse, his face pale from blood loss and pain, but Wade ignored him for the moment. There would be time to deal with the gang leader after he made sure the rest of the threat was neutralized. As he worked, More townspeople began to emerge from their hiding places, drawn by the sudden silence and the realization that the nightmare they had been living with for months might finally be coming to an end. Among them was Doc Patterson, an elderly man who had been too sick to practice medicine until Sarah's arrival had given him a new lease on life. "Miss Sarah," the old doctor called out as he hurried across the square, his medical bag in hand. "Are you hurt? Let me take a look at that wrist." Sarah flexed her fingers and rotated her wrist carefully. It was sore and would probably bruise, but nothing seemed to be broken. "I'm all right, Doc, but Mr. Morrison is going to need attention for that gunshot wound." Wade looked up from where he was securing the last of the prisoners. "He'll get medical attention after he's safely locked up, not before." Udril, there was something in his tone that brooked no argument, and Doc Patterson nodded his understanding. In the frontier justice system, a man's crimes often determined the order in which he received care, and Jake Morrison had committed more than his share of crimes against the people of Copper Ridge. The town's temporary sheriff, a nervous man named Collins, who had been appointed after the previous sheriff had mysteriously disappeared, came hustling across the square with a set of leg irons and a look of amazement on his face. "Mr. Wade, I can't tell you how grateful we all are. We've been trying to find someone willing to go up against Morrison and his gang for months." Wade finished tying the last knot and straightened up, dusting off his hands. "Just happened to be passing through at the right time, Sheriff. Though I have to say, I've been tracking Morrison for quite a while. He's wanted for murder and robbery in 3 territories. This news caused a stir among the gathered townspeople. If Morrison was wanted by territorial authorities, that meant there might be a substantial reward for his capture. More importantly, it meant that he and his gang could be taken away from Copper Ridge permanently, tried in a proper court, and quite possibly hanged for their crimes. Sarah approached Wade as the sheriff and several volunteers began the process of getting the prisoners ready for transport to the territorial jail in Silver Falls. She wanted to thank him properly, but she also found herself curious about this quiet man who had risked his life for a town full of strangers. "Mr. Wade," she began, then stopped, suddenly unsure of what to say. "How did you thank someone for saving not just your life, but your dignity, and possibly much more?" Wade looked at her with those pale grey eyes, and she saw something there that surprised her. Behind the hardness and the carefully controlled violence, there was gentleness, kindness even. "You don't need to thank me, miss. Just doing what needed doing." Sarah Mackenzie," she said, extending her hand, "and I most certainly do need to thank you. What you did here today, what you risked for people you don't even know, that takes a special kind of courage." He took her hand briefly, his grip firm but gentle. "Thomas Wade, ma'am, and I've seen what men like Morrison do to good people when nobody stops them. Couldn't ride by and let that happen." They were interrupted by Sheriff Collins, who approached with a worried expression on his face. "Mr. Wade, I hate to ask this of you after what you've already done, but would you consider staying in town for a few days? Just until we can get these prisoners transported and make sure there aren't any other gang members lurking around who might try to cause trouble." Wade was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from the sheriff to Sarah to the faces of the townspeople who had gathered around them. These were good people, she realized. People who had been living in fear for too long and deserved a chance to rebuild their lives in peace. "I suppose I could stay for a few days," he said finally. "Make sure everything settles down properly." The relief on the faces around them was palpable. Sarah found herself feeling relieved as well, though she wasn't entirely sure why. There was something about Thomas Wade that made her feel safe in a way she hadn't felt since arriving in Copper Ridge. Maybe it was simply knowing that there was someone in town who could handle whatever trouble might come their way, or maybe it was something more personal than that. Over the next few days, as the prisoners were transported and the town began to return to normal, Sarah found herself spending more time in Wade's company than she had expected. He had taken a room at the boarding house run by Mrs. Henderson, the same woman whose baby Sarah had been trying to reach when Morrison grabbed her. The baby's fever had broken that same night, as if even the children of Copper Ridge could sense that the danger had passed. Wade proved to be surprisingly easy to talk to once you got past his initial reserve. He had traveled extensively throughout the territories, working sometimes as a lawman, sometimes as a bounty hunter, always seeking out the kind of men who preyed on the innocent and defenseless. He had grown up on a small ranch in Texas, he told her, until Comanche raiders had killed his family when he was 16. He had spent the next few years learning to use a gun, with the single-minded determination of someone who never wanted to feel helpless again. Sarah found herself sharing her own story in return. How she had grown up in a well-to-do family in St. Louis, the daughter of a banker who had expected her to marry well and settle into a life of comfortable domesticity. Instead, she had shocked her family by insisting on training as a nurse, drawn by a desire to help people that she couldn't fully explain even to herself. When her parents had died in a cholera outbreak 2 years ago, she had used her small inheritance to come west, looking for places where her skills were needed most. "What made you choose nursing?" Wade asked one evening as they sat on the porch of the boarding house, watching the sun set over the mountains that surrounded Copper Ridge. Sarah thought about the question for a moment, trying to put her feelings into words. "I suppose it was seeing how much suffering there is in the world, and knowing that I could do something about at least a small part of it. Every person you help, every life you save or pain you ease, it feels like you're pushing back against all the cruelty and darkness just a little bit." Wade nodded slowly. "I understand that. I've spent most of my adult life trying to do the same thing, just in a different way. Sometimes I wonder if it makes any real difference, though. There's always another Jake Morrison out there, always more innocent people who need protecting. But that's exactly why it matters," Sarah said earnestly. "Because there will always be people like Morrison doesn't mean we should stop fighting them. The people in this town are going to sleep peacefully tonight because of what you did. Their children are going to grow up without fear because you were brave enough to stand up to a bully. How is that not making a difference?" Wade was quiet for a long time, staring out at the darkening sky. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. "I've been moving from town to town for so long, I sometimes forget what it's like to see the results of what I do. To stay long enough to watch people rebuild their lives. Maybe that's something you should consider doing more often," Sarah suggested gently. He looked at her then, and she saw something in his eyes that made her heart beat a little faster. It was a look of longing, of a man who had been alone for too long and was beginning to remember what it felt like to want something more than just the next job, the next town, the next confrontation with evil. "Maybe it is," he said quietly. The moment was interrupted by the arrival of a rider carrying news from Silver Falls. Jake Morrison and his gang had been successfully delivered to the territorial authorities, where they would await trial for their numerous crimes. There was indeed a substantial reward for Morrison's capture, which the grateful townspeople insisted that Wade should keep in its entirety, but there was other news as well. The territorial governor was so impressed with Wade's actions in Copper Ridge that he was offering him a position as a territorial marshal, with jurisdiction throughout the region and the authority to go wherever he was needed most. It was exactly the kind of opportunity that Wade had been working toward for years. A chance to make a real difference on a larger scale, to bring law and order to places where both were desperately needed. It was also, Sarah realized with a sinking heart, an opportunity that would take him away from Copper Ridge, possibly forever. Wade read the letter twice, his expression unreadable. The townspeople who had gathered to hear the news waited anxiously for his response, hoping he would accept the position, but also hoping he might decide to stay and serve as their sheriff instead. "It's a generous offer," Wade said finally. "I need some time to think about it." That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She found herself walking through the quiet streets of Copper Ridge, thinking about all the changes that had taken place in just 1 week. The town felt different now, more hopeful, more alive. People were talking about plans for the future, about expanding the school and bringing in new businesses. The fear that had hung over everything like a dark cloud was finally lifting. But she was also thinking about Thomas Wade and about the decision he would have to make. She had no right to ask him to stay. She knew that. They barely knew each other, and he had important work to do in the world. Work that could save countless lives and bring justice to places that had known neither for far too long. She was so lost in thought that she almost didn't notice the figure sitting on the bench outside the church until he spoke. Couldn't sleep either? Wade's voice came out of the darkness, gentle and understanding. Sarah turned toward him, grateful for the company, but also nervous about what he might have decided. Too much to think about, I suppose. This week has changed everything for this town. And for me too, he said, shifting over on the bench to make room for her. I've been thinking about what you said, about staying long enough to see the results of what you do. Sarah settled beside him, acutely aware of his presence in the darkness. And what conclusion did you reach? Wade was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. I've spent 15 years moving from place to place, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots or form real connections with people. I told myself it was because the work was too important, because there was always someone else who needed help. He paused, and Sarah could feel the weight of what he was trying to say. But maybe the real reason was that I was afraid. Afraid of caring too much about any one place or any one person, because caring makes you vulnerable, makes it hurt more when you lose what matters to you. Sarah felt her heart beginning to race. And now? Now I'm thinking that maybe being vulnerable isn't the worst thing in the world. Maybe having something to lose is what makes fighting for it worthwhile. He turned to look at her, and even in the dim starlight she could see the intensity in his eyes. Sarah, I know we haven't known each other long, but what I feel for you, what I've seen of who you are and what you do for people, it's made me want to be a better man. To find a way to make a difference that doesn't require me to always be moving on to the next crisis. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Thomas, I'm going to turn down the marshal position, he continued. Collins asked me to consider taking the sheriff's job here permanently, and I think I'm going to say yes. Copper Ridge is going to need someone to help it grow and prosper, to make sure that what happened with Morrison never happens again. And I'd like to be part of that. I'd like to be part of building something instead of just tearing down what's wrong with the world. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sadness. Are you sure? It's such a big decision, and you have so much to offer the whole territory. Wade reached over and took her hand in his thumb tracing gentle circles across her knuckles. I'm sure. The territory will find other marshals, other men to do the job, but Copper Ridge, and you're what I want. If you'll have me, that is. Sarah squeezed his hand tightly, her heart so full she could barely speak. Thomas Wade, after what you did for me, for all of us, how could you even doubt that you'd be welcome here? I wasn't talking about the town, he said softly, and she could hear the vulnerability in his voice, the hope and fear all mixed together. Sarah turned to face him fully, reaching up to touch his cheek with her free hand. Then let me be very clear. Yes, I'll have you. I'll have you for as long as you'll stay, for as long as you want to be here. When he kissed her, gentle and tentative at first, then with growing passion, Sarah felt something settle into place in her heart. For the first time since coming to Copper Ridge, she felt like she was truly home. Not just because of the work she was doing or the people she was helping, but because she had found someone who understood what it meant to fight for something bigger than yourself. As they sat together in the quiet darkness, Talking softly about their hopes for the future, Sarah realized that Thomas Wade had been wrong about one thing. His decision to stay in Copper Ridge wasn't going to prevent him from making a difference in the world. Instead, it was going to allow him to make the kind of difference that really mattered, the kind that lasted for generations. He would become not just a sheriff, but a protector and a leader. Someone who helped build a community where families could thrive and children could grow up safely. And she would be beside him, using her healing skills to help the town grow and prosper, to welcome new residents and care for those who were already there. In the months that followed, their prediction proved accurate. Copper Ridge began to attract new businesses and new residents, drawn by the reputation of a town that had stood up to outlaws and won. Wade proved to be not just an effective sheriff, but a wise leader, someone who could settle disputes fairly and keep the peace without having to resort to violence. Sarah expanded her medical practice, training several local women to serve as midwives and nurses' assistants. She and Wade were married 6 months after that first night when he had saved her from Jake Morrison, in a ceremony attended by the entire population of Copper Ridge and several surrounding communities. Their marriage became something of a symbol for the entire region, proof that even in the harsh landscape of the frontier, love and decency could triumph over violence and cruelty. Sarah continued her work as a healer, and Wade continued his work as a protector, but they also found time to build a life together that was rich in all the small joys that make existence meaningful. As Sarah stood in the doorway of their small house one evening, watching her husband teach a group of local children how to throw a rope properly, she thought about how much had changed since that terrifying day in the town square. Thomas had been right when he said that no one would touch her anymore, but his protection had given her something even more valuable than safety. It had given her the freedom to become everything she was capable of being, in a place where her skills and her compassion could make a real difference in the world. The gunslinger's promise had been kept, not just in the moment when he had drawn his weapon to defend her, but every day since then, as they built a life and a community based on the simple but powerful idea that good people deserve to be protected, and that sometimes the best way to fight darkness was to create light. If you enjoyed this tale from the Old West, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more stories of courage, justice, and frontier life. We'd love to hear from you in the comments below. What other legendary figures from the Wild West would you like to hear stories about? Share your thoughts and let us know what draws you to these tales of the American frontier.